Good afternoon. Wow. Um, I hope you had a wonderful lunch. I'm fully aware that the sessions after lunch can be tricky because the digestion is taking its energy. But I'm sure we'll manage as we'll have three excellent speakers with three very interesting topics. This session is somewhat unique because all of the presentations here are based on articles of this wonderful proceedings book. A few words about the book. Last October, our call for papers generated almost 200 paper proposals in the form of short abstracts. And after an initial round of filtering, we received 44 full papers. This went through double-blind review by at least two members of our academic review committee. And in the end, we have 14 papers in the book, three of which are presented in this session and others in other breakout sessions. The setup of this session will be pretty straightforward. It will be divided into three separate parts. Each of the presenter will get 15-20 minutes to present, after which we'll have approximately 10 minutes for the discussion. So I invite you and also the speakers to be ready to think along and ask questions after each presentation. We'll first hear from Max Metz, who is a college lecturer in politics at the University of Oxford and a research affiliate of the Oxford Cyber Studies program. Then after Max, Professor Martin Libicki will present. He is, of course, a renowned expert on cyber war and currently holds Kieser Chair of Cybersecurity Studies at the US Naval Academy. His presentation today will focus on cyberespionage norms. And then the third presentation will be done by my dear friend, Dr. Kenneth Kears, who is currently a senior research scientist at Komodo. He's also a NATO CCDCOE ambassador and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And Kenneth is, by the way, one of the founding fathers of CyCon. He was one of the persons who created the conference back in 2008. And his focus will be on traffic analysis and the strategic implications of it. And without further ado, I'll give the floor to Max, who will speak about the organizational integration of offensive cyber capabilities.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you for the kind introduction. So we'll talk about organizational integration, and more specifically, organizational integration of offensive cyber capabilities, and we'll look at both the benefits and risks of it. Do you have a clicker or not,
Martin
by any chance? Oh, so organizational integration has been commonly examined in relation to firms' performance. If done well, it's conceived to be kind of similar on par as organizational innovation, to enhance competition with other firms. Of course, governments seek organizational integration too, and it's becoming an increasingly relevant topic when we talk about cybersecurity, given the large amount of institutions which have been created over the past decade. More specifically, organizational politics, organizational design plays a central role in the use of military capabilities. Yet at the same time, it's a comparatively underdeveloped area of research. We tend to focus on, for example, the nature of cyberspace to understand some of its implications, but we hardly ever focus on the organizational characteristics and how they affect our actions in the literature. So the underlying theme is there that we cannot fully understand the use of cyber capabilities without studying the organizational structure in which such use of these capabilities is embedded. So the general question I'm going to address today is, what are the potential effects of organizational integration of offensive cyber capabilities? And to put my argument up front, or for military folks, my bluff, I will argue that there are basically three benefits of it, and these are not as controversial as the risks. The benefits is that it will enhance interaction efficiency, knowledge transfer, and resource allocation. But there are also a number of risks too. One is that it likely intensifies the cybersecurity dilemma. It might increase costs in the long run, and it might also, what might be labeled, impel the cyber mission creep. Even though the risks outweigh the benefits, the benefits outweigh the risks, the point is that ignoring those negative effects, which we have hardly discussed, is dangerous and might lead to various forms of escalations. So for the remainder, what I will do is I'll first touch upon a few of the basics, I'll specify some of my research, clarify a few of those concepts. I'll briefly talk about the three benefits, and then I will talk in more detail about the risks, and if I have time, provide some concluding remarks, and also discuss the limitations of my research. So organizational integration in relation to cybersecurity could take place at various levels. I've distinguished here between three. First, the high level, between governmental organizations and other actors, maybe private or other actors. The mid-level, between government organizations which do not focus on cyber and those who do. And the lower level, between those government organizations who focus on cyber. Now here, and we can also make a distinction, although in practice it might become slightly blurred, and we can talk about it in more detail, between defense and offense. And so here today I'm going to talk about type F, the organizational integration of offensive cyber capabilities. For military folks, in simple terms, it's that one between C&E and C&A. Okay, so the point of me focusing on that is because there's been relatively little research on it. Offensive capabilities have still been, and the use of it have been shrouded in secrecy, but the stakes are high. Its misuse of it might lead, again, to escalation. And I put up this quote from Jamie Shee to basically clarify that indeed it's becoming increasingly important for a large group of states, because a large number of countries are currently establishing offensive capabilities, though we might significantly disagree on the number which he has put on there. Of course, it's also relevant for not only upcoming cyber powers, so to say, but also those who have been well established. You might have heard of the debate on, again, splitting the dual head role in the US, or also other cases like Israel going potentially against the trend of not setting up or deciding to not set up a cyber command earlier this year. So the general assumption underlying this is that I look at organizational integration, which is directed towards the development of sophisticated capabilities. The idea is that unsophisticated capabilities don't require an organization in the first place. Have a look at my paper on how I define it and the elements of sophistication. But the point is, and that's especially relevant for understanding how integration takes place, is the nature of output. And in the case of sophisticated attacks, it often is conducted in a multi-stage operation, what is in economic terms called sequential interdependence. And more specifically, the key point there is that often the goal only becomes clear of the attacker at the very end stage of that attack, rather than early on. And we'll get to a second what that could mean for integration. Now, the second point I need to clarify is basically, so if we are integrating, what's the aim of it? In the end, what do we want to achieve? What should an offensive cyber capability look like, and how do we want to use it? And I've put up 4 dimensions here. First, it needs to be effective, which could be described as reliably providing unauthorized access to a computer system to cause damage, or in the case of exploitation, more general. Legal, and we can have a long discussion on what it's supposed to mean, but here, for the sake of, here we could talk about minimizing undesired effects. It needs to be cost efficient, and I need this element of permanence, ideally. But maybe just as important is to talk about what we do not aim to achieve. And when we normally talk about organizational integration, particularly in the case of firms and companies, we want to often get to this process of standardization. The idea is that if you would drink a can of Coke in one place or another, that it tastes the same, that there is a continuation of, the quality always remains the same, and when you get your coffee at Starbucks at one place, that it tastes the same as when you get your coffee at Starbucks at another place. The point here is that that's not what we want to achieve. Eric Gartzke and Lindsay also talk about this element of deception of sophisticated capabilities. And as a result of that, innovation and flexibility is much more important, the element of surprise, than standardization, having the same output each time. There are various forms of integration. I've put up 4 here, which are probably the most common, whether that's a joint appointment of a director of intelligence as well as a command, or whether that's the more revolving door model of moving people, or whether that's the same training program, or placing an intelligence group within a military command. The point is that overall, some of the general benefits and risks exist. So let me briefly talk about some of those benefits. The first point I'm making is that integration leads to interaction efficiency of intelligence and military activities. Probably the most obvious point I make. Now, the obstacles actors have to overcome to conduct sophisticated cyber attacks tend to be underestimated. And I divide them into 3 barriers. First are the knowledge-based barriers, second, the economic and material, and third, the organizational ones. Now, the point is that the interdependence between intelligence collection activity and the military activity is essential, as a great amount of preparation is required to understand the targeted systems. And probably the most famous case on that is, of course, Stuxnet, which I delve into in the paper. And OI facilitates this interaction, making it the most obvious benefit. Some have actually also made similar claims, although there is not as much research about it on Ukraine. Have a look at a War on the Rocks piece of Rob Morgus. So I'll talk about that in my research in more detail. I will now go over it for the sake of time, so we get to the potentially more difficult to understand problems at the end as well. The second point I make is that integration increases the opportunity for knowledge transfer, making it the second benefit. So when we look at firms generally, what they say is that interconnected organizations hold a comparative advantage over their more autonomous counterparts due to the ability to transfer knowledge across constituent parts. So maybe if a chef writes a new recipe, develops a new recipe at a restaurant, and people like it in that restaurant, it's more easy when it's a franchise to move it to another restaurant and have it there as well. Generally, knowledge is split between what is called explicit knowledge, that knowledge which can be communicated, and tacit knowledge, which is much more difficult to articulate. Might come close to what Germans would call Fingerspitzgefühl, and I'm not German, so I'm not sure if my pronunciation was right there. But it's as often in the hacker's experience, it's those implicit operational procedures, or it's when, like, a young cook starts working with a chef and then finally finds the fine-grained details of his work. The point which is generally made when we look at economics is that integration can also facilitate that type of interaction, which is much more difficult to do in a formal setting. Thirdly, integration minimizes mission overlap and improves resource allocation. So we can see various levels of resource allocation efficiency from people, capital, and potentially previous activities as well. So to pick one on people, the idea is that increased integration leads to, or allows for the opportunity for more specialization, and a result of that can create the potential for task complexity, unlike more disintegrated organizations. We can talk about the details, hopefully, in the Q&A. So having swiftly gone through these benefits, let me take slightly more time to focus on the 3 risks which I've put on paper. The first proposition I make is that integration intensifies what can be labeled as the cybersecurity dilemma. In conventional international relations, what we mean with the security dilemma is that when various actors are in a state of what is called anarchy, that mutual fear leads to states to resort to an accumulation of capabilities to defend themselves. But often the intentions are unclear what defense means and whether this can be used for offensive purposes as well, which in turn leads to unintended spirals of worsening relationships with a potentially tragic outcome. That's the argument normally made about the security dilemma. Now, various people have talked about a potential cybersecurity dilemma. Ben Buchanan, in his recent book, has done so probably in the greatest detail. And his argument is that states which aim to assure their own cybersecurity have an incentive to intrude into strategically important networks of other states and will thus threaten, often unintentionally, the security of those other states, risking escalation. The point I'm making here is that a negative externality of knowledge transfer, what we know from firms' performance is that it often leads to a loss of distinct organizational cultures with their practices and playbooks. And the point here is that the commonality in behavior, which integration stimulates, further blurs the line between when a cyber espionage operation ends and when a destructive operation starts. It's already very difficult to know, but now, particularly from a defender's point of view, it's becoming even more difficult to discern the attacker's intention and to accurately respond. Now, potentially the implications of that is what we also see coming back in the proportionate response debate, especially after Sony and also the DNC hack. But the point of it is that if we respond proportionally both to one, the actual damage caused, and two, the intent of the adversary, it's the second part which now becomes more difficult to discern, and it's that second part which also means that we often don't know whether a proportionate response is actually proportionate or not. Secondly, I believe that integration might risk cost ineffectiveness in the long run. And the starting observation for that is that offensive cyber capabilities can be said to be transitory in nature, meaning they are rather short-lived in their ability to cause harm or damage. Now, I've published an article on this, and I'm not saying that they are equally transitory. In fact, they are not. But the point, one of the elements which changes this is the fact that cyber capabilities causing visible damage are more likely to be discovered than espionage capabilities. In fact, what we have witnessed is that often sophisticated espionage capabilities could remain in systems for years and years and years. Now, due to the integration of activities, the deployment of destructive cyber capabilities also increases the risk that espionage capabilities, exploiting sometimes the same vulnerabilities and same coding procedures, are exposed as well. So, again, taking a case like Stuxnet, my argument would be that Fanny, the worm which mapped out the industrial control systems before Stuxnet, would probably never been found if Stuxnet would have taken place. And similarly, when we have these overlapping capabilities, both in the vulnerabilities they use, as well as in the way they are operated, it makes it also much more likely if a destructive attack is discovered, that the espionage capabilities are discovered as well. Which means that integration makes offensive cyber arsenals more volatile and costly, and multi-year cyber programs more vulnerable to a low return on investment. Finally, I believe that integration could lead to cyber mission creep. This point of mission creep, and that's the reason why I put this quote here on the PowerPoint, has been often made on the global war on terrorism. But what I mean here with cyber mission creep is that it's the risk that an organization responsible for offensive cyber activities goes beyond their core mission in the use of these capabilities. And there are probably two principal forms in which that could occur. First, the first form is that the risk that initial intelligence activities through cyberspace go beyond their core mission and lead to the use of cyber weapons. So that computer network exploitation might lead to computer network attacks for the very idea of like, hey, we can do this already, there are no organizational differences here, I can just talk to this guy and conduct a network attack operation as well. The second point is that when the military is gradually conducting more cyber activities, even when it concerns minor domestic disorders rather than war or other emergency situations. So the point here is that what might happen is that cyber commands or intelligence agencies mutate into what can be called all cyber organizations, suddenly dealing with a much wider range of activities they were initially doing. So to conclude, to go back to my earlier slide, I believe that there are both benefits and risks, and certainly the benefits may overcome, are more significant than the risks, but we should not ignore the negative effects, as that can be dangerous. Now, where do I believe that future research could be valuable? First, as it is one of the very first pieces which focuses on organizational integration and generally how organizational capabilities or organizational structure affects the use of capabilities, I do believe that we require more empirical testing on it, as difficult as it might be. Secondly, as I mentioned before, the nature of cyber capabilities places greater emphasis on innovation rather than force control, like it is often the case in production processes of firms. So the question which we still have to answer is how integration can ensure that organizational efficiency does not come at the cost of organizational and individual flexibility. Finally, again, I focus on only a minor aspect of integration here, right? Only on what I mentioned here as type F. So hopefully in the future, we can conduct more research with broadening this up and looking also in what can be called supplier integration, looking at how other actors, particularly in this field, could work together. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks. Thank you, Max. We have a bit over 10 minutes for questions. There were a lot of aspects to your list of risks and benefits. I would go right away and see whether it generated some questions from the audience. Okay, while you think, I'll have some questions on my own as well. Which of the listed benefits would be cyber-specific in a way? Because this organizational integration theory seems to be rather universal. Is there anything specific to cyber offense in those risks and benefits?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the interesting part of it is I think that actually the benefits are more universal. So if we would talk not just about offensive integration, but also about defensive integration, integration might still benefit in the sense that it will minimize mission overlap, create knowledge transfer, et cetera, et cetera. But the risks which I've pointed out, they are more unique to offense, right? Especially the enhancement of the cybersecurity dilemma, or potentially these other dimensions as well. So I think there we see more unique dimensions. Now, one thing which I didn't mention in this presentation, which does come back in the paper, is obviously leaks in information security. And I think there we can risk it in both sides, right? So if we have more eyes on the same document, for example, which might happen, but that's not an inherent risk, that could also be on the defense side.
But what about trust between different organizations?
As a positive thing? Or
But I guess it's a limitation. On the international level, it's a huge limitation. But is it an important factor when you think of creating this integration within different national organizations? I would assume that there's quite a bit of lack of trust, let's say.
Yeah, so there are two questions here, right? So one is whether trust is a potential barrier of organizations integrating. And the second question is whether trust is an effect of organizational integration, right? The first one I don't address. What are the exact obstacles to create integration? On the second one, and I haven't seen this coming back, yeah, there might be an argument to be made, right? When you are sitting, and this is a specific form of integration, when you're sitting next to this other guy who you normally only talk over the phone, inherently that might enhance trust. I'm skeptical about when it comes to like beyond government organizations with other actors.
Do we have now any questions about Max's? Yeah, there's one back there.
Yes, do you think it's possible to test your hypothesis? And given the fact that most of the attribution is difficult and the case studies would probably be classified by the states, is it something that you could actually get data to verify your hypothesis of benefits and disadvantages?
Oh, and please also identify yourself before the question. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good question there, and to some degree, yes, we can. But we will be selective in our case studies. So more specifically, I do believe that we have, again, a great deal of information these days on an operation like Stuxnet, where we could specifically look at what was required for organizations to conduct this operation and how they had to work together and like the potential effects of that. Having said that, yes, there are also limitations in the sense that it's becoming more difficult for an academic, at least, to conduct research at multiple domestic organizations of various countries and do a comparative analysis of what can be called the most and least likely cases of where these propositions hold. I think that's, for someone like me, impossible to do, to be realistic.
There's another question back there. Yes.
Yeah. Is it on? Yeah.
Yep.
Sorry. Yeah, Brad Bigelow from Shape. I just want to pose a devil's advocate question. The assumption, and I think it tends to be the prevailing assumption of the application of offensive capabilities, is that it's going to be very surgical and targeted, and therefore it's highly, highly dependent on this preparation, dependent on intel and espionage. But isn't there also an argument, if we want to use the example of WannaCry, whoever is responsible for that certainly didn't target, didn't do intrusion and surgical targeting. They did more of classical mass denial service. It seems to me that there could be an argument made that even though there aren't necessarily downsides, collateral damage risk and things like that, that it's not implausible that there are people envisioning offensive who may be thinking as pure, dumb, production, brute force attacks because they're simple and they're effective. Let's remember when we first started using electronic warfare, we didn't do the sort of sophisticated forms of electronic warfare that have been seen now. We just did brute force jamming. So it seems to me that there's an argument that there may be viable military applications that don't involve such sophistication and complexity of activities. I just wondered what your response to that would be.
Yeah, so I completely agree, right? And let's add one dimension to that. We can see undesired effects in two ways. One is most commonly discussed when a state or when an actor wants to cause an X amount of damage but causes much more damage than intended. So a famous case would be the Murray's worm. But we can also see it the other way around, which is actually just as interesting. A case like Shamoon is a case where we see an actor aiming to cause way more harm than it in the end did. And surely it affected 30,000 workstations at Saudi Aramco, but due to 3 or 4 coding errors, as Kaspersky pointed out, it could have caused way more damage if it would have been more well developed. More specifically, the elements which allow us to develop a highly targeted attack are still quite ill understood, right? And it's quite so we can distinguish it between the various levels. The first level of DDoS attacks tend to be, at least according to the latest paper on that from Bellavin and Lin and Landau, would say that, right, these are inherently targeted just by design. But then we get indeed to the group of wipers, such as Shamoon, Sony, etc., and that's where intelligence would be required to conduct way more targeted attacks. And at the same time, indeed, these attacks could be also conducted without much intelligence. And yes, I agree with you that indeed a relatively unsophisticated actor could conduct those attacks and cause like a relatively high amount of harm or damage. It is another question, though, what they would achieve with it, right? Because surely there is a correlation between damage cost and the ability to coerce, but it's not a direct one. It's unclear if you would wipe an X number of drives, what you get for it in return. And then indeed, the third case, which I hopefully agree are slightly more difficult to conduct, are those cases which attack critical infrastructure, because indeed there is not just experience and knowledge required of coding, but often also of the very critical infrastructure which you're attacking, and that it requires intelligence.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Okay, so I'll ask my last question from you. Most states are only in the beginning processes of establishing their capabilities for doing offensive cyber operations. What is the trend in your view? Are they going for this integration? And also on top of that, if you look at the US, there's a potential decision to actually separate US Cybercom and NSA. So what would be the reasoning behind that, considering your theory and thoughts?
Yeah, so I think the general trend, especially for these states which are currently establishing an offensive capability, is to very quickly establish a cyber command. And it might be partially for kind of, I wouldn't call it copycat behavior, but the idea of like, hey, gosh, we see these other states developing a cyber command, a lot of publicity. We hear about the WizKids being hired and to become part of it, and highly integrated organization. It sounds very fancy, and we can write beautiful news articles on it, right? And then often it might still then take many, many years before an actual capability comes out of it. So it's kind of a way of like signaling potentially to other states that, hey, we're on top of this as well, and we are becoming a moderate force, even if they can't signal with the actual use of a capability. So that's, I think, a trend which we see. But we also witness, particularly in recent years, indeed, one like potential other directions. So one which I quickly mentioned is, I don't know too much about Israel, and there might be other people here in the audience who will know much more about it, but from the article I read from the Jerusalem Post a few months ago or earlier this year, is that indeed they decided to not have a military command which integrates these various activities. And again, on the US, I mean, that's a question where we've seen, when it was established, to my knowledge, that was a clear reason because, hey, the capacity which the dual hat rule was one because the capacity was still at the NSA. But also already in mind that in the future, these two organizations will be disconnected. And from what I've gathered of discussions, and I'm sure that there are some American folks here in the room who will know about it, more about it than I do, that's something which in the future will likely change, where once the military command, so the cyber command, has its own capacity, that these two will become disconnected.
Thank you. I think we've run out of time for this part. Let's give a round of applause to Max. And next up is Martin. Here we go.
Here I go. Okay. There is a tendency in this world to liken the rules under which cyber attack, cyber espionage, cyber mischief takes place, and model them on the physical world, because the physical world is the source of all the knowledge that we've had until a few years ago. And under these rules, you can say, for the most part, that because physical attack, the use of armed force, is generally considered improper, particularly if unprovoked, that therefore cyber attack, in other words, the use of cyber techniques to disable somebody else's use of a computer, to corrupt information, to break the things that the computer might be connected to, is also considered out of bounds. On the other hand, espionage is considered something that states do. It's considered something that states have the right to do, and therefore, by analogy, cyber espionage is something that states do, and something that states have an untrammeled right to do. And if you take a look at the Tallinn Manual, you will see this notion disposed of pretty much in a paragraph, that unless your cyber espionage implicates other cyber attack modalities, generally speaking, it's not something for which international law has much to say, which means that as a general principle, it's allowed. Okay, so we conclude, cyber attack bad, cyber espionage okay. Only that's not the way it's working these days. And it's not the way it's working these days because the United States in particular, but I believe in general with support of other Western countries, has defined at least 3 types of cyber espionage that it considers to be illegitimate government activity. Okay? Oh. Is that how the slides go? Okay, the first one is economically motivated cyber espionage. The other one is to take information from cyber espionage and put it into the criminal world. And the third one is cyber espionage for the purposes of doxing. Let me get into these in sequential order, okay? Since 2009, the United States has raised objections with other countries, most notably China, that basically tries to make a differentiation between cyber espionage for national security purposes and economic cyber espionage for competitive purposes. At first, the US position was, we spy on other governments, we don't spy on companies. When it turns out that that wasn't strictly speaking correct, the new formulation is, we spy for national security purposes, but we do not spy to give our companies competitive edge. And you had a long interaction, it's a euphemism, between the United States and China on this issue. It was raised in the Sunnyland Summit in 2013. It was the motivation behind the indictment of 5 PLA members out of the Western District of Pennsylvania in 2014. It was the motivation for a presidential executive order in early 2015. And in the summer of 2015, it started to look quite likely that the United States was going to start imposing sanctions on Chinese companies for carrying out actions that was never prescribed by international law. Now, for those people who are trade lawyers in the audience, and I'm sure there must be many of you, you may recall that there's something called the World Trade Organization prohibition on the TRIPS, having to do with intellectual property, which says countries should not steal intellectual property from one another. But as it turns out, I'm prepared to argue if anybody has a question, that intellectual property by 2014 was no longer the primary focus of Chinese economic cyber espionage, so TRIPS wouldn't have worked as a defense. The only thing that worked from the US perspective is that the United States president and the Chinese president in September 2015 agreed bilaterally that neither country would carry out cyber espionage for economic purposes on each other's companies. Subsequently, China took similar agreements to other countries, and finally in the G20 made it in effect a multilateral agreement. Now, as to the separate question about whether China is actually keeping to its agreement, there is a certain amount of controversy, a kerfuffle as it were, and the best estimate is that people who are willing to be quoted in the press are confident that Chinese cyber espionage is way down, and people who are not willing to be quoted in the press are a little more skeptical. So I will say I think that it's a significant decline in cyber espionage, and I will leave it to the audience to define the word significant. Okay, the second one was an event that almost took place. When it was discovered that the Office of Personnel Management's 22 million records had been taken, initially, US officials and former US officials said, it's unfortunate that it was done, but it is in fact fair game for espionage. And I think one of them hinted that if his organization had the capability of doing the same thing, he would. But underneath that official calm was the concern that this information would wind up in black markets. Okay? And if it were to wind up in black markets, I think I can say with a degree of confidence that the United States would have raised this issue to the country that we thought took the data and said, spying is one thing, selling information into the black markets is something else. It's mixing the powers of the state with criminality, and the sort of criminality that all countries condemn. Now, this touches on a broader issue as to what is a legitimate relationship between a state intelligence agency that does cyber espionage and criminals who do cyber espionage, okay? I think there's a broad consensus that there should be no relationship at all. These are two separate fields, and that crime is crime. If you take a look at the US indictment of several Russians several months ago, it turns out that 3 of them, if I have my numbers correct, were accused cyber criminals, and 1 of them was an employee of the Russian government. Now, whether this employee was acting on behalf of the Russian government, freelancing, I'm not entirely certain, but there is a strong suspicion in the United States that some countries mix crime and cyber espionage a little too freely, okay? And then there's another country, whose name I won't name, but it rhymes with South Korea, has also been accused of complicity in an actual bank robbery and is currently the most likely suspect before WannaCry, okay? Now, a certain amount of criminality requires taking money from somebody, but there are cybercrime markets in which the mere possession of information has a monetary value. And so I believe that if OPM had ended up differently, and as far as I know, there is no evidence that information from OPM has ended up in the black markets, I think you could have seen a certain amount of action saying, hey, this is an illegitimate use for cyber espionage. Okay. Then there's politically exploited cyber espionage, and this is a bit controversial, so let me try to thread my way carefully. In early June, late May of 2016, it was discovered that there was an intrusion into the Democratic National Committee. And at the time, the perspective was that it was legitimate state espionage if, in fact, as is all likelihood, a state was involved in taking this information, okay? It was information that was relevant to predicting the political processes in the United States and therefore of national security interest. 2 months later, we found out that that was not the purpose of the hack, that the purpose of the hack was to take information of potential embarrassment to the people who owned the information and put it up on WikiLeaks. And in fact, this is one attack of which it was a pattern because there were other such attacks on the Democratic Congressional Committee, on Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, on the Soros Foundation, on the World Anti-Doping Agencies, and later on we saw in 2016 on the campaign of the presidential candidate. Okay? The United States took issue with it, even though it was not a cyber attack. It was cyber espionage. Now, people talk about this as an interference with the political process, but the word interference has the prefix inter, which means it's between. And we can get into this, but this is an offline discussion. I would not label it as an interference in a political process. I would label it, however, as unwarranted influence. Okay? There are, in U.S. perspective and Western perspective, ways that countries can influence elections. For instance, President Obama spoke out on Brexit. President Obama spoke out on the Scottish referendum. This was not considered illegitimate, okay? But what happened with the DNC was within the United States, among those people who admit that there was a DNC hack, and I don't want to get into that politics, a sense that it was in fact illegitimate intrusion by the Russians into the American political process. And in fact, after the election, the United States responded in a relatively, depending on your political orientation, weak or mild way, okay? Through the expulsion of diplomats and through the closing of certain Russian-owned facilities. Now, you have to thread the needle very carefully when you try to explain why this is illegitimate. And my best explanation is that cyber espionage for the purpose of doxing is an illegitimate use of cyber espionage. Okay, let's take these 3 instances together because I want to make a sort of a broad generalization on this, okay? What the United States is converging towards but has never adopted a policy, and under the current administration is just a big question mark on whether we will get there or not and in what direction, is that there are legitimate uses for cyber espionage in order to, and they are to inform national security decision making. In other words, maybe this is too parochial, what our folks do is legitimate and what other folks do is not legitimate, okay? But in fact, I think there's a lot of Western consensus that promoting commerce, facilitating crime, and interfering, I see I use that word again because it's so easy, mucking around in political processes is an illegitimate use of cyber espionage. And that national security considerations alone justify the state use of cyber espionage. Now, so we have an open question here. Are we done with just these three examples? One of the essential features of cyber, and one of the things that makes these conferences so much fun, is that both tactical and operational surprise are critical to the fact that cyber works at all. Okay, if somebody gets into your system, they often got in because you say, I didn't know there was a pathway here. And that could be anything from a 0-day to insufficient configuration management, okay? But there's also a great deal of surprise at the strategic and the operational level. Okay, I was part of a task force on cyber deterrence about a year or two ago, okay? If we had enumerated those things that the United States would take issue with, I would give you dollars to donuts. We would not have put down anything like the DNC hack as something the United States would take issue with. But once it happened, we took issue with it, okay? And very few people went around and said, you did not pre-declare this, because it was sort of clear that it was something that a country could take an issue with, even though that it wasn't explicitly written down. So I think it's a fair bet to say that in the next few years, there will be a form of cyber espionage that will be worth taking exception to, and I don't know entirely what it is because it will in fact be a surprise. But I do want to move to another type of cyber espionage, and that's the use of cyber espionage to set up a cyber attack, okay? The GGE generally has an agreement that countries should not attack other countries' infrastructures. We're all well and good with that. But there's a subtle flaw in that agreement, because once one country takes down another country's electric power grid, for instance, you're sort of not at peace anymore. Whether you have declared it or not, you are in essence engaging in the first round of a war. So the notion that you shouldn't attack each other's infrastructure in peacetime is sort of self-contradictory, because the minute you attack each other's infrastructure, you're not in peacetime anymore, right? Okay, I got that. What about putting implants in other countries' infrastructure? Okay, is that legitimate cyber espionage activity? Now, why do I call it cyber espionage? Because in fact, many ways of taking down infrastructures start with activity that is indistinguishable from cyber espionage, okay? You look at an implant in a power grid, and you can't prove, or you often can't prove, that it was there to take down the power grid. All you can basically argue is, you don't really have anything interesting to learn from being on my power generators, right? You guys want to learn how to generate electricity? We got textbooks. We'll even talk to you guys. We're not competing with you, right? That's not the way you learn how to generate electricity. And that would suggest, in fact, the scope for another norm, is that cyber espionage into critical infrastructures that have no good justification as cyber espionage should also be considered illegitimate activity. I would have to confess that I was not entirely successful in selling that to other folks, but this isn't to say that the topic isn't going to come up sooner or later. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I think I've ended early, as I was encouraged to do, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you. So let's open it up for questions. Yes.
Hi, I'm Ido from Israel, and I'm wondering about the distinctions you've made.
Okay.
At the end of the day, it's the same shared cyberspace for all of us, so to speak.
So to speak.
So to speak. And when we distinguish between espionage for national security purposes and then its spillovers to espionage for criminal purposes, like the WannaCry attack, for instance, that was conducted through national security tools, quote unquote. How do you feel about these distinctions? What is acceptable and what is not acceptable if it's all one space?
Well, look, all of cyber is one space, all of the oceans, but in fact, activity on the ocean isn't entirely legal. Okay, I I would have to actually take a look at hard cases, because I don't have any problems saying that WannaCry is crime, that the Swift thing is crime, that a lot of the things that the Russians were doing on Yahoo was a crime. That seems fairly straightforward to me. And if in fact the OPM hack, the Office of Personal Management hack, had ended up in cybercrime markets, you could have said, well, at least that use was going to be crime. Okay? If at some point you had a close case, then I would have to start doing a little dancing and making distinctions. But right now, it doesn't seem like a close case to me. And just because every place is accessible from every other place doesn't mean that they're all in the same space, right? You know, what they say with a good approximation, my driveway is connected to every driveway in North America, right? That doesn't mean it's all my driveway. Okay.
And how do you view what is the added value of having these distinctions in place, in your opinion? Well, why do we need to go there?
Well, the added view, if you're going to stop activity in cyberspace, which you don't want, it's really a an n-step process. But the first step is you have to have some sort of consensus that it's bad. The second step is you have to have some sort of arrangement, and there's been interesting discussions here on how you do this, that in fact this bad action was carried out by some person. And the third stage is now you got to do something about it, right? But the first stage is you have to admit that it's illicit activity. Now, one of the things that was true about the US-Chinese discussions about cyberespionage is that the official Chinese line before September 2015 was, we didn't do it, okay? The official Chinese line, as far as I can tell, was never that they are two separate, that they were indistinguishable, okay? Which had the advantage that when they finally agreed that they were distinguishable, they didn't have to walk it back. Now, privately, those objections were made. But that's far different from doing it publicly.
Thank you.
There's one question there.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrew. I'm from the United States. Professor Lipicki, in your paper you discuss cyber espionage activity, specifically the allowed uses of collected information.
Right.
However, can you give your input on the idea of allowing companies to develop the capabilities to actively pursue the perpetrators of cyber attacks performed against them? Essentially, do you feel some sort of cyber self-defense activity may become legal?
Well, I mean, the way you phrased the question is an empirical one. Will it become legal? And the answer is, I hope not. So I'll get you in the positive. The normative question is, I hope not. Okay, I'm not a big fan of hacking back because I am a big fan of rule of law, and I don't think things are so bad in cyberspace that we need to start abandoning the rule of law in this particular domain. The other thing is that a lot of what takes place in cyberspace is measure countermeasure. In a world without countermeasures, the first measure looks really neat, okay? I'll go in there, I'll find the server that has all of my information on it, I'll take it off, the harm to me is limited, and I can go home happy. Okay, but then you have to ask the next question, what are people who steal information going to do differently if you start doing things differently? And the answer is they'll start developing their own countermeasures. If I think, in fact, that you can trace something into a server, I will put it on multiple servers, okay? Or maybe I'll put it in an encoded form in a public server where you can't afford to wipe it out, or something like that, okay? That both sides always get a vote in this. And one of the problems with with basically hackbacks and the privatization of law enforcement is that you've got to think several steps down the road to figure out how it's all going to end up. And in my opinion, the bad stuff remains, the good stuff is transitory.
I'll get one question in. I'll use my... okay.
Ricardo
Go
Sevilla
ahead.
from Switzerland. Thank you very much for this very enlightening presentation. You made a point about using cyberespionage for political influence. There are other means of espionage that can be used for political influence, like, for example, filming VIPs, doing strange things in hotel rooms, or such sort of things, which are also can have the same consequences on the political process. And in the end, one may ask itself, is this part or this chapter should not put into the more global chapter of information warfare, which is just fighting at the neutral level, or at the information level?
Well, let me make a practical consideration here. Generally speaking, traditional forms of espionage have put the spy at physical risk, okay? So it is within a state's a right to do economic espionage using people, but if you're caught, you can go to jail, and people have gone to jail that way. One of the ways you modulate the threat from traditional espionage is, in fact, putting people at risk. But cyberespionage does not put individuals at risk to nearly the same extent. And because it doesn't, you have to move the level of risk higher up to the normative and nation-state level.
In the article, you also touched upon attribution, and I'd like to ask about this. Let's say states agree on these norms. How would they verify the attacks? And you also mentioned this idea that the US could even share its capabilities to a certain extent to generate more stability.
Geez, I was hoping you wouldn't bring that. Mostly I was hoping you wouldn't bring that up because we haven't had a lot of attribution here, okay? I think it is possible to work our way towards political arrangements which would facilitate, in some limited cases, attribution, okay? For instance, if two countries sign an agreement that says that neither of them will do X, they can at the same time develop an arrangement which establishes an institution that allows them to enforce the agreement, okay? It's sort of like we agree to binding arbitration, and this attribution organization, outfit, whatever you might call it, is part of what's considered the arbitration mechanism. They're the sort of the fact finders to try as part of that enforcement mechanism. But like I said, I don't want to go too deeply into this because we've had a great deal of discussion, and it turns out that who funds the organization tends to make a lot of difference. What's the membership? Do we put countries on it? Do we not put countries on it? And then eat up the clock.
Okay, let's have a few more questions from the crowd. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Kristen Stoddart, a barista with university. I also work for Airbus Group on cybersecurity life cycles, and part of the work I've been doing with them has looked at these range of issues, including industrial and corporate espionage, including protection of critical national infrastructure, and so I know your work fairly well. I think the intermix between industrial and corporate espionage and state-based espionage is intermixing with criminality also, and it's a very complicated picture. Within that, you have plausible deniability and a range of other issues as well. So I wonder whether you could speak to that a little.
It's interesting that you mentioned you worked for Airbus, because this is one of the cases where the difference between national security and corporate espionage becomes a fairly fine line, right? Airbus, I'll speak in terms of Boeing, because I'm a little more familiar with their product line. They make military aircraft, they make civilian aircraft. You find an implant somewhere in your corporate systems. Was it national security cyber espionage to figure out how to make an, I think they make the F-35, am I right? Lockheed Martin is, what the heck. Okay, they make some military aircraft, and they also make commercial aircraft. So is the purpose of this intrusion to figure out how to make a competitor to the 787? Or is the purpose of this intrusion to figure out how to make a competitor to a military aircraft? Well, the first one would be considered illegitimate. The second one would be considered less illegitimate. And to just make it complicated, a lot of the aircraft in the US inventory basically converted civilian aircraft anyhow. Okay? So yes, there are fine lines. What about the Chinese intrusion into the New York Times? Was that a national security type corporate, cyber espionage? Well, okay, the United States wouldn't think of a newspaper that way, but I could understand that the Chinese government might think of the New York Times that way. I think I can say with a high degree of confidence that they were not carrying out cyber espionage in the New York Times in order to figure out how to build their own version of the New York Times.
Okay, we can take one more quick question from the audience. But if there's no question,
no,
okay,
standing up.
There's one.
Mark Seitz from the Naval Academy.
My
Just in
students.
terms of defining norms, can anyone do it? Can any state do it? Or what kind of prerequisites or standards must be set before that happens?
You mean what is the norms-making process itself?
Yes, sir. And who's really allowed to do them? I know in your paper you talk a lot about the United States, but I mean, is it just the United States, or who else are we looking at?
Well, that touches on a very good question, okay? Because norms are basically properties of countries that stand behind them. And the United States is a large country, and if it's prepared to stand behind the norm, that has a certain amount of weight, okay? But as a practical example, if you've got a norm that doesn't have the other big players in it, it's not really a norm, it's a negotiating position. And so, for instance, we talk about the Budapest Convention, which is a norm because it was accepted by Western Europe, it was accepted by the United States, and it's accepted by another Western countries around the world. But it's not accepted by Russia and China, okay? So, is it a global norm or isn't it a global norm? And the answer is, if you can't enforce it against Russia or China, or if you can't get them to behave similarly, it's almost a partial norm in this case. And this really is a question of politics. If you're going to wait for North Korea to ink a norm, you're going to be waiting forever, right? If you don't want to wait for Russia and China to sign a norm, you're going to take what you have, which isn't particularly powerful. Now, not every norm necessarily has to start with the United States or even a large country. A good case of this is the norm against landmines, okay, which was started well outside the United States, and for which, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we're on board that particular convention, okay? But in fact, it's been accepted because of its widespread signature. And not to get topical or anything like this, do you think the Paris Accord is going to go away if at 3 o'clock Eastern time our president says, no, that's not for us? That norm will still be there. We will just not be members of it, except for California, but that's a different country altogether.
Thank you. And next up is Kenneth, and he's going to speak about traffic analysis, which is a bit of a different topic, but still has strategic aspects to it. Go ahead.
Okay, so thanks for being here. So the big takeaway, I think, for this portion is that assuming unbreakable encryption, if somebody can still see you and who you're talking to, they can usually surmise what you're talking about, right? So that's the downside. Traffic analysis is basically who is talking to whom, when, and for how long. But that will usually give you all you need to know. And really, human conversation is very difficult for computers and humans to understand. So you really just want the metadata anyway, because you can process that more quickly. So here with pizzas, reporters, they'll sit out in front of the Pentagon late at night and just count the number of pizzas going into the Pentagon. And if on average it's 200, but then one day it's 2,000, well, there's something going on in the world that they should probably know about. So with all of Alan Turing's heroic exploits during World War II, he had to rely on thousands of people to do the intelligence work to get to the hard stuff. Right? And also about World War II, you know, when the Japanese sailed from Tokyo Harbor, you know, they kept the import communications going so that American eavesdroppers would still think they were import. And then we tried to fool the Nazi high command into thinking we were going to invade Pas-de-Calais and not Normandy. That's all traffic analysis and counter-traffic analysis, which is very important. Now I'm going to ask you a very personal question. Have you ever been in a restaurant and within your field of view, there is a table and a couple sitting at the table, right? You don't know these people, but you're wondering, what are they like? What's their relationship like? You know, what are their lives like? How do they get along? Have they been married forever? Is this the first date they're on? Is it really exciting? Well, even if you can't hear what they're talking about, just in your peripheral vision, you can probably tell a lot about those basic things. Who's in charge? Who's giving the commands at the table? Which direction is the traffic flowing? Are they listening? Is it important what they're talking about? right? Is it back and forth? Is it negotiations? Or is it basically top-down, chain of command style communication? Is there silence? Are they sitting there for 5 and 10 minutes at a time, not saying anything? This is very important, right? Very, very important. And it tells you a lot about who they are, the nature of their relationship, right? So the same thing for a couple is the same thing for potentially the White House and the Pentagon and the CIA and the NSA, right? Are they talking a lot? Are they not talking at all? Is it this way and that? Is it back and forth, right? All this is very important. So counter-traffic analysis, too, you can put it in different categories. And so traffic analysis and analysis itself is a lot about breaking things down into easily understandable chunks, right? So with counter-traffic analysis, you might burst your communications because I know you're listening. I know there's eavesdroppers out there somewhere. So I might burst them, maybe only on Tuesday or only on one Tuesday each month, because I'm hoping that you're not going to be listening when I'm talking. With spread spectrum, I might spread them out across various frequencies. So that you're only listening on AM when I'm communicating on FM and vice versa. And then indirect communication with the internet is pretty good, right? Because I've done some studies in the past couple of companies I've worked for, and basically if you have a big map of command and control servers, you'll see that there's communications between every country on the planet in terms of malware comms. So you can communicate a different way every time. And so if you're in America and you are spying on the Pentagon, well, you can route your traffic through Iran, China, and Zimbabwe, and the chance that counterintelligence is going to follow you is maybe slim. The only way to really get around traffic analysis is through continuous ciphertext, right? In other words, you're communicating all the time, and it's all nonsense, except the real communication is stagged, is hidden within the fake communications, so that any eavesdroppers, they're just hearing noise all the time. Right? So any other type, human courier, for example, in Abbottabad, Pakistan, right? Famously, Osama bin Laden didn't have internet or television. And so then you have to watch traffic analysis on people coming in and out, right? That was a famous story. So when you look at the whole world of malware traffic, which is what I like to do, it's pretty inscrutable. It's like quantum mechanics or something. There's so much of it going in every direction. How can you possibly sort this stuff out? But I still don't think it's rocket science. I think analysis can get you far. So there's something like 5 billion data points on this one PowerPoint slide. But it's our top malware categories that I'm looking at. And then the little orange circles are countries. And so you can kind of see, Trojans, this is really a big malware category, and here's all the countries that Trojans affect. But you can blow it up, and you can say, well, I only want to see the top 5 malware categories in the top 10 countries. And here, then you can say, this may be doable, actually. And you can see, I don't know if you can see the digraphs, the country code, top-level domains, but you can see RU, US, UA, PL, ID. These are things I love. These are really fun to look at. And I've even got some KP in my traffic, right? That's how big my company is. What's KP? No? North Korea, right? So I'm one of the few analysts who has some data, a couple thousand rows from North Korea. And you can plot them on a traditional map, or you can put them in ratio buckets to look at so that you can see what your traffic looks like and how countries are moving over time through your traffic. We'll get to time in just a second. But plotting on a traditional map is very helpful. And then you can see by colors very quickly, even analysts, you don't have to be a hacker, you don't have to be a coder, but you can do some cool traffic analysis that way. Another way to do it is just to think in what ways can I bring in external data from, say, Wikipedia. So in this case, I just went to Wikipedia and I said, okay, I've got one column here of malware data for 6 months in this case, in descending order. And that's the size of the bubble, but then I just plotted on a graph with GDP and population. So you can kind of start to see where malware meets wealth and population. So in this case, the US is clearly the biggest target on the planet because we've got basically the most people with the most money and the most malware. Right? So that's where cyber criminals are going to be looking for money, because see, Russia and Poland as well have enormous malware problems, right? Even though they're a little bit lower down on the GDP scale. But again, you can kind of see clustering. One of the things I look for is a clustering of similar data. And here you can see Australia, Canada, Great Britain, Germany, France, Italy, all clustered there in about the same size malware bubbles and same region of GDP and population. Then I can take a map of the planet, and then I say, okay, in descending order, I want to see the top 5 malware categories, and just show me number 1, right? And so you can start to see some interesting things across the planet. And again, putting countries into malware buckets helps you kind of see where attackers are going, or at least where their code is going, who's vulnerable to what, and then you can orient your defenses a little bit better. So here you can see green is virus. That's the countries with the top malware category as virus. And you can see South America, Libya, Egypt, and it's interesting because some of them, they have not only socioeconomic similarities, but geographic similarities. So they might sit on the same pipe, right? They might have the same language, but that factors together in interesting ways. Maybe wealth as well as geographic location will determine how you need to orient your defenses against hackers. So you can kind of see Southeast Europe here. Elsewhere, like Russia, for example, the dark blue is Trojan. So in my company, that's the top malware category that we see is Trojan, and most of the earth is in that way. The lower socioeconomic countries, especially those that are at war on here, you can see have worm as the top category. So worm is basically an autonomous virus, right? You don't need to open an attachment or click on a link. It exploits vulnerabilities in and of itself. And you can see Congo, you see Yemen, Somalia. These are countries where worm is the top malware category. So Trojan is our most complicated data set, and you can do anything with it. So ransomware, for example, very often will be one thing that if you get a Trojan on a system, you decide to do. And earlier discussion today was low and high value targets. Cyber criminals, they've got all these compromised computers and they're trying to figure out what to do with them. But with a Trojan on the system, you can say, well, this is not such a valuable computer. Maybe I'll just encrypt all the data here and then see if they'll pay 200 euros. They won't pay that. We'll see if they pay 50 euros. Right? And so there's a market space there in which you're trying to figure out what is the sweet spot, right, to make money. But Trojans, you can see, we have thousands of them we look for, and you can see that Russia, even though there's a lot of worry about Russia being the source of cyber attacks coming out of Russia, Russia itself, as far as malware detections, has quite a big problem on its hands. Here's the NATO space. You can kind of see Southeast Europe as well as in that green category with a problem with viruses. For me, I'm looking right now at Spain and Belgium because at least in the first quarter of this year, they had the most backdoors ratio-wise within my data. Another way that I look at our clients is to put them into verticals. So in this, there's just two takeaways here. In verticals, like if a client is within the education vertical or the government or healthcare, then you can start to say, here is what your threat profile looks like. And you can orient your cyber defenses much better if you don't have to look at the whole threat landscape of malware, but only parts of it. But here are just two takeaways on this little chart. Trojans are everywhere, right? So in every category where I'm trying to identify where our clients belong in terms of economic sector, you'll see Trojans, a lot of Trojans. But in engineering, media, retail, education, etc., that's on the far right. And then on the far left, technology, all of the malware categories, backdoor, virus, packed malware, Trojan, and backdoor, they all have arrows going toward technology. And why would you want to target technology? Because that's the keys to the virtual kingdom of cyberspace, right? When the Chinese go after Google, it's because they don't just want to get one dissident, they want all the dissidents, right? And so they want to be in the system so that they can potentially get unknown adversaries and dissidents in the future. A couple years ago, the Syrian Electronic Army went after, in the course of 1 week in 2014, Viber, Tango, and Truecaller were online websites with together about 1 billion users. So that would give quickly the Syrian government access potentially to the IP addresses and telephone numbers of people within Syria communicating with spies or journalists overseas. But they don't go after them individually. They would like to own the website, right? Because then immediately they're going to sort all the Syrian IP addresses to see where the traffic is coming in and out of the country. So here, this is in its early stages, but I'm also plotting countries by vertical to see, which countries have the top target within their space, right? And so this is going to take a long time, but you can kind of see I've got a range of so far that the technology, online services, and telcos, that sort of thing, are dominating the effort. But here, it may be too small to read, but you can see I've got 3 layers, basically, that I'm dealing with on this chart, and you can mix them up as you please. But I've got, on the inner ring, I've got the vertical, or the economic sector, and then the second ring, the type of malware, and then the third ring is the family. So on the right side in the green, it's online services, and this is in our data for the first quarter of 2017. And online services, Worm was the top malware category. And then we had NIMDA and Runounce as the top malware families, right? So if your job is to protect online services, then you can focus more specifically on types of malware and even specific families that can give you an edge. In ransomware here, it's too small to read, but I'll tell you, you can see over the course of 2017, the US basically rising in our data. One way that I like to look at data is by ratio. So I say, okay, for all of our ransomware data for 2017, let me look at it by week or by month. And then you can see for a family or a country as they rise and fall through the data, right? So it kind of tells you which way things are going, and you can actually do predictive modeling based on this. And you can say, next month it looks like the top target. In this case, over the course of 2017, at first part of the year, ransomware was mostly in Russia. Then it moved to Iran. Then it moved to Poland and the US. Right? So this can help. This can help with defense. Within our verticals here, I've got technology, telecom, and online services. You can see that the United States in particular, but also I see Thailand, Italy, Russia, for example. But these will be the keys to the virtual kingdom that attackers would really like to go after because it gives them what the military calls a force multiplier. You're not just hitting one potential adversary, but many adversaries in the future, possibly. So as an analyst, one of your best friends, if not your best friend, is time, right? Because all communications on the web are bounded in time, in human time. We can't wait forever for a response, right? So if you plot things on a timeline, you can see a lot of interesting things. And so here, I just put all of our African countries on one timeline over the course of 2 months, and then I say, okay, I only want to see, for each country, its apex once, right? And so then you can click one after another and see for Ethiopia, for Congo, for Yemen, for South Africa, on each given, over the course of 2 months, what was their single worst day. And you can click on it, and you can open it up and see, aha, that was a particular worm that hit this country. And if you have the time and effort, you can dig into that data, and you can get as specific as you want. And so that's one of the takeaways from this talk, too, is that very quickly with traffic analysis, you can go from the strategic to the tactical level very quickly, if you have the time and the analytical help on hand. And so that also has huge human rights and privacy implications, right, for any country and for the planet, basically. Because if there's somebody, and there are many people out there doing strategic analysis on internet communications, then if you're doing something interesting, if you're communicating with a potential spy or something, then algorithms can be written for that and processes to find you relatively quickly. Or if you're in a country like Belarus and you want to participate in an opposition political party, then also you can be found fairly quickly. So this is another layer of analysis, but this is on a timeline, so I put just 6 or 7 Middle Eastern countries. And I was doing this at FireEye a few years ago, and as well, it yields surprisingly positive return on investment as an analyst. Just plot malware on a timeline and then read the news, and you can see that malware, like everything else in cyberspace, is just a reflection of human affairs, right? So anytime there's an election, an invasion, a business merger, anything like that, it will be reflected in cyberspace, which will include malware communications, right? So here, I can't promise you that these things are directly related, but as an analyst, you're silly to avoid or neglect this kind of analysis. So on the left, this is Saudi traffic, the pink. There was a missile fired from the Yemeni rebels toward Mecca, right? And that was the highest peak during that period for malware communities. And so maybe you're asking yourself, well, what would be the relationship there? It could be anything. It can be law enforcement actions, foreign intelligence collection, cyber criminal, hacktivist, you name it. This is just a leveraging of compromised infrastructure, right, within Saudi Arabia. The yellow, there was a bomb that killed, on that same day, 48 Yemeni soldiers. A bomb in Egypt. In that Turkey bomb, that's on July 1st, it was the discotheque explosion that killed 35 people, something. And then, again, on the far right of the chart, there was a missile fired in Iran, which logically might interest all the countries in the region, right? So even though those things might not be directly related, it is an important element, right, is to sort of put a geopolitical filter on your malware analysis, so that if you're responsible for a particular enterprise or a particular country or at the Pentagon, pay attention to what's going on in the Middle East and in the South China Sea, and that'll help you to do malware analysis. So that's my talk. I appreciate your time and happy to take questions.
Thank you. We have 8 minutes for questions. I'll start off. Your dataset is based on Komodo's data. How can states somehow access this? And if they can, are they actually utilizing this for decision making?
Yeah, so again, any sufficiently large company would have similar data. You need a strategic data set, basically, to work with. But I was at FireEye before, and I did a big study in 2013-14 that had 30 million rows of data over 18 months, and I was sure, and I can show you if you're interested, send you the paper, that I could see the annexation of Crimea, as well as the Israeli invasion of Gaza, that both took place in 2014, in our malware data. So this current at Komodo has been around for 20 years, so I'm really the first analyst they've hired to look at their data, and just in the first sort of big scoop of data in, trying to pull fish out of a sea, it's it's a little bit like coming out of the Sea of Galilee. There was more fish than we could pull up, almost. And I had about 5 billion rows of data since something like Halloween of last year. So we're putting it in a big analytical framework, and I'm using some cool viz or visualization tools to look at it. But absolutely, I asked that question to my boss because I've been there just less than a year now, but I get a number of PhD candidates asking me, wow, I could really use that data. And so I asked my boss about it, and he said, absolutely, we're building an academic portal, and it will be available for analysis, because again, Komodo's been around for like 20 years, and they've got something like 90 million installations around the world. So they're at a point where they'd like to take advantage of that for business purposes, I'm sure. But for me, I'm interested for analytical purposes in what you can learn about a malware and learn about the world and international relations.
Okay, do we have any questions from the crowd? There's one here and one in the back.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Gazman from Sweden. And the traffic that you mentioned, that you have around 5 billion of data, could it be used or configured so that you can also interpret Daesh narratives? For example, right now or this year, they've been talking about recruitment, and this time they're talking about doing something on the like. Thank you.
Yeah, so I am sure that there is an angle that you could take, even in my data, to see various things that Daesh would be up to. And I'm sure with 5 billion rows of data, all of the APTs would be represented in there too, if you have the time and ability to look at it. This is malware data, right? So these are basically malware detections from installs that we have in these countries. And so, and those are going to be a wide range. Again, we have like 35 malware types that we're detecting. And so, but then you can go deeper in malware families and types and subtypes and particular versions of malware, etc. By all means, that is a good question. It's somewhere in that data you can tell a whole lot. Now, at the level of social media analysis, in terms of digital propaganda, that would be a farther leap from the kind of malware analysis that I'm doing. But I'm convinced personally that there's a wide range of operations, from information gathering to denial of service to information manipulation, that you should be able to see given a sufficiently large pile of malware detections, right? Because what happens in the national security space is, in the case of the United States, the White House, you really have one customer in the intelligence community, which is the president, right? And so everybody's hoping to get in the PDB or the Presidential Daily Brief one day. But the White House, depending on what they're interested in, will pass out these things called national security requirements that filter down to all the agencies. And then the agencies have got to respond, and they want to please the boss. And just like students, if you're going to write an academic paper, you used to go sit in the library at night and thumb through hard copy books, but that's no longer the case. I mean, now you're going to go to an academic database and sort by citation count, and then in 5 or 10 minutes you can have a decent bibliography and for your upcoming paper. Well, what's true for students is also applicable and true for soldiers and statesmen and spies, right? Is you do most of what you do online because of the ubiquity of computers and the power to push and pull information from any point on the globe. So when the White House pushes down these national security requirements and they go into the bureaucracy, agencies are going to go out and they're going to do things in order to fulfill those requirements. And very often it's going to be in cyberspace. And that's why if a country is about to invade another country, you should be able to see indications of that and what's called strategic or indications and warning if you know where to look.
Nicholas? Yes, let's take one last question.
Thanks a lot for providing us with these great slides. I was wondering whether your company is also using this data to predict certain events. When you see these patterns, do you dare to say this might happen and you look back and see whether you're right? And if so, what do you actually do with that?
Yeah, so I got that question a lot when I did this paper in 2014 for FireEye, because I felt like right there you can see Crimea and Gaza in the data. And so then the question is well, what can you predict? What's next? Who's going to be invaded next week? And you should be able to if you can develop a deeper model, you know. But there's all kinds of things that you can't predict, you know. The chaos theory, you know, will tell you that predicting the weather has been one of the great goals and holy grails of computers since they were created. But they haven't gotten much better at predicting the economy or the weather. But, you know, really, there should be kinds of things, like there is cyber espionage that leads to cyber attack, right? There's kinds of malware, and the more you fingerprint not only countries and malware, APTs, and campaigns, you should be able to do some predictions, basically. Like if the FBI notices that, you know, this is a Persian family of malware that's found on, you know, the electricity grid in New York and LA and Washington, somebody should get on a phone, right, and say, you know, we see what you're doing, and you better knock it off. Right? So that kind of predictive modeling, you know, if you can do some attribution and you can see that this is, you know, industrial control system focused malware from a top threat actor, that's sufficient cause to pick up the phone on the national security computer and make something happen at the decision maker level.
Thank you. We have to end here. Good luck in digging in this data set. Let's have another round of applause for all of the three gentlemen. Thank you.